So please, Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer. I was also in the DR from 05 to 07. And I also, right after Peace Corps, got my grad degree in social work. I work in healthcare, so I've been in oncology the entire time. I started in clinical practice and was there for about 8 years, and then worked for a small nonprofit in DC, and now work for a large healthcare system, ANOVA, in administration. So looking forward to talking with you all tonight.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And just a quick reminder to everyone, if you're not a panelist, if you could please remember to mute yourself so we're not seeing your face pop up on the screen. You feel free to leave your cameras on if you want to be more interactive, or you can turn them off during the presentation. So our order for events tonight, we'll be going through 3 different sections of the NGO sphere and job hunting. So we'll first talk about NGOs' mission, structure, and funding, and how different NGOs work differently. Talking about NGO size and location and how that impacts your work and experience at an NGO. And then, of course, how to get a job at an NGO, what you should look out for, what skills you should highlight, how to use your Peace Corps experience to find the best position. And then we'll have a final half hour available for questions and answers from the group here. So first, we're going to talk about NGO mission, structure, and funding. So my question for the panel is, how does your NGO's mission, purpose, vision, all of that impact the work that you do? And feel free, whichever one of you wants to answer that question first and start things off here.
Happy to go. So I work for a healthcare system, which is a little different than probably Matt and Jessica's experience. And our global mission is to provide world-class healthcare every time, every touch, to every person in the community. So we have a pretty broad mission. Within the healthcare organization, I work for kind of a smaller division of it called Life with Cancer. And our main focus is providing psychosocial care to anyone impacted by cancer. Previously in the Northern Virginia area, because people needed to get to us to access care. But now with COVID, we've moved everything to Zoom, so people can be anywhere. Everything we provide at Life with Cancer is free of charge, because we know cancer can be really expensive. So we want to make sure people can access the services that they need. Mission, funding, what was the other piece of that? There were many parts of that question, sorry.
Sure, it was more the mission, purpose, and vision, you know, how 2 institutions could be saying they do the same work, you know, working with immigration or with cancer, but because of what they say they want to do as their purpose, the implementation can be very different or distinct.
Yeah, so I think at ANOVA, one of our main visions and purpose is patient experience and making sure that we're taking care of the community. And I think that you may hear that from a lot of different healthcare organizations. Some are more financially driven, some are more patient experience driven, some are driven by the types of patients that they see. ANOVA, especially the Cancer Center, is really trying to make a name for itself in patient experience and making sure that the journey through healthcare is as easy as possible, which if anyone has access to healthcare in the United States, you know that sometimes it can be very difficult to navigate the system, navigate insurance, navigate all of the different pieces. And so I think what we're trying to do based on our mission is make that a little easier on patients coming into the system.
I can jump in next if you'd like. So our vision, our mission at IFPRI is a world free of hunger and malnutrition. And so it's a very, specific to the point mission, and sort of what does that mean is a lot deeper than that. So in terms of what role we fill, we're a bit of a hybrid between sort of a nonprofit. We are formally registered as a nonprofit in the US, an international organization, and a research institute, so the academia piece of it. And so all of our work is, in fact, research-driven activities. And in terms of what that means, in terms of linking directly to our mission, is that like when we as teams or as senior researchers at IFPRI are sort of seeking new work, we really have to be able to filter through that mission in terms of like, do I want to work with this like healthcare program, you know, in whatever location? The answer is generally no. It really has to be like filtered through our primary mission if we're considering taking on new work, and that's sort of, and then our mission, you know, is broad, but we have a very like a multi-pronged strategy, and you can sort of see the details of that. And if I were a better employee, I know all the 5 pillars of our strategy, but I'm not, so you know, whatever. But it's online, so anyone else could find it. But so that's sort of how our mission and purpose and vision sort of drive what we do as an organization.
I think one thing I would just add to that is, I mean, per someone's or organization's mission or purpose is going to direct a lot of their daily activities. But I would say that it's, you know, because we're talking about getting into potentially working at an NGO, I think it's a good place to look at and sort of see what an organization is about and what they're looking to do. But also to recognize that organizations change. A lot of what an organization is doing or they're focusing on depends on their leadership at the time and what they're wanting to do. So just because a mission says, you know, we're looking to do X, or this is the type of work that we're doing, whoever's in that organization at any given time may have a particular focus about the type of work that they want to do. Just for an example, our organization has always worked with immigrants and refugees for over 100 years, and that's really part of our mission. And one of the things that we've always, or I would say predominantly done in the past, you know, couple decades has been working domestically with some work internationally. And one of the things that we're looking to do is to start to grow our international work. And that's really being driven by our current leadership. And honestly, because of the current circumstances right now, because, you know, refugees aren't being let in, immigrants aren't being let in. So there's not as much work for us to do domestically if we're just going to stay working domestically. And so I think that, you know, it can shift at any given time as well.
Great. Well, that leads well into the next question that I have, which is, how does the type of work that an NGO do define what that working relationship is like in the office? So, you know, comparing an NGO that is more focused on grant making versus consulting for maybe the US government versus really focused on program implementation. For those of you on the panel who've had experiences at a couple different places, how would you compare those different types of workspaces?
So we're interesting in that, you know, we have, so our headquarters is in Arlington, Virginia, but we have field offices throughout the country. And I would say, and we also partner or do subcontracts with multiple organizations across the, you know, across the country as well. So working in the office where I work is very different than probably if you worked in one of our field offices where you're working with clients on a daily basis. It feels much more of like a community-based organization, whereas one of the things in my role is we're actively looking for other partner organizations and actually, you know, looking to give contracts or subgrants to other agencies. And so our role looks a little bit different. And I think all of it can be rewarding. I just think that depending on what you want in terms of how directly involved you want to be in the actual work that's getting done with individuals or on a particular project, you know, some of those are more directly involved and you're more kind of boots on the ground versus being further away and doing some of the back end work that needs to get done in terms of a particular project or serving a population. So both can be rewarding. And I think, at least for me, where I'm at right now, one of the things that's nice about it is I feel like the work that I'm doing has a larger impact. Whereas before, working with individuals was also really rewarding, but it was just on a smaller scale, and being able to take that experience and using it into, a larger degree now is something that can be beneficial. But I don't see clients anymore, which, you know, some people that's really hard for, and they want to work with people. So something important to keep in mind.
I think when I think about how the organizations I've worked with over the years have been funded, that's really important because it kind of sets the tone for the type of work that everyone's doing. Healthcare is oftentimes revenue generating, but there's pieces of it that are revenue generating and other pieces like social work that are seen as overhead. And I think, you know, when you think about working for an organization, it's important to understand their funding structure, because especially when we think about times now like a recession is coming, if an organization is primarily grant funded or funded through philanthropy dollars, if there's not multiple revenue streams, it may not be as secure of an organization. So before I went to Inova, I worked for a fairly small nonprofit, and we did a lot of grant writing. Almost everything we did was grant funded. And so while our mission may have been one thing, oftentimes we were trying to either fit that into certain grants or find grants that would fit into our mission. And so we didn't always have as much flexibility to provide the services that we wanted to provide. And now working for a much larger organization, we have a lot more funding streams, but there's a lot more bureaucracy. So there's a lot more layers of having to get approvals and follow certain regulations and marketing. And so that adds additional layers, but the funding streams are a little more secure. And you know, I think in all nonprofits, and it probably depends on what layer you're at, but there is a sense of having to raise funding for what you're doing oftentimes. So there's a lot of cultivating of donors and really stewarding people. Oftentimes, even if you're not the one in charge of that, it's, you know, there is an important piece of kind of taking care of the mission to make sure that the organization has funding.
So in terms of the dynamic of the work environment, most sort of international NGOs, particularly if you're based at a headquarters location, are really, I don't want to say, you're very far removed from any sense of implementation. It's like the total other end of the spectrum of what your experience was like in Peace Corps, where you might be like delivering a charla to like 50 youth. Oh, that's optimistic to say 50, but like a crowd of youth. Often your work at an international NGO is like so like on the other spectrum of, you know, very little interaction with anything that's going on in the field. And so, you know, you got to really think about, like, if this is what you want to do, like, is this, I mean, you're going to miss, as Matt kind of explained, you're going to miss that, like, that daily, like, intrinsic reward from interacting with people, but you might get, like, a bigger long-term, seeing the big picture is rewarding in a different way. And that ties, I mean, in our work, you know, again, as Jen said, with the funding, like the funding environment is really hard right now, and it's going to be hard for a long time, likely. And I think we're all sort of being mindful of that in a lot of ways. Where I work, we do have multiple revenue streams that range from sort of researchers, you know, writing their own grants, to partnerships with large philanthropic organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to governments, not just the U.S. government, but from you know, like the German government, the Dutch government, etc. And so that sort of helps our flexibility in terms of, like, as the U.S. government has, you know, been less willing to invest in international development focused endeavors. We have a lot of backup plans with more progressive governments. So, you know, I mean, yeah. And so, I mean, in those funding ups and downs really kind of, you know, I mean, everyone's sort of responding to donors. Different people within the organization are responding to different donors. So, I mean, it makes for an interesting dynamic, but work gets done, so.
Thanks, Jessica. Yes, I would say I currently work for the U.S. government, but I've also worked in NGOs and other places myself. And definitely never brought up in my studies on international development how much politics of the countries you're getting funding from really can impact the work that you do and where you can work. So it's definitely something to consider. So the next question that we had was on funding sources and budget size, which I think you guys already delved into a bit. But if you had more to add on those different types of funding sources, like what is the difference between getting money from a foundation versus getting money from the government? Is one more strict than the other? How easy is it to get funding? You know, and with COVID, where you think things will go with funding, and what should people look for when they're applying for jobs, when they're looking at, if they can figure out where the funding's coming from, if they can kind of figure out how stable an NGO is going to be in the next few years.
So in terms of like different funding sources and their stability in your relationship, I think it depends less on how you classify those donors and more on just individual characteristics of specific donors. For example, like Gates Foundation, when we talked with our project officers recently, have been like, 20% flexibility on any budget line for anything related to COVID, and just you have to document it, etc. The European governments are particularly strict about like holding to every line item in your budget, and like I had to do like a whole rebudgeting for something under the German government recently. They're just like very strict reporting guidelines. So it just varies more on an individual basis. And quite frankly, it's not typically your own responsibility to know that. That's like senior people, your accountant, those sort of people who sort of keep up with that. Mm-hmm. Sorry, you asked a two-part question, Susan. I know what else I was going to add. I'm sorry. So one thing that I would suggest that you do in terms of when you're considering applying for any organization that's classified as a nonprofit is that typically such organizations have to file a tax return form. I believe it's called like a 990. They're all they're all publicly available on like ProPublica or whatever sort of things. Go find them, look at them, figure out how much money the organization has. You can see salaries of top paid people on there, and you can figure out like, are they running in the red every year? That's dangerous to go to work there. Like, so do your due diligence on that when you're considering applying from somewhere. And you can see the variety of donors that they bring money in from as well.
Yeah, and even if they don't have their 990s ready, their most recent annual report should have financials in there, and that's a good thing to look at. I think last year we were like 94% government funded, and we're in trouble. We serve immigrants and refugees, and in this administration, we're in really big trouble right now because we don't have a diversified funding stream. And even though we get most of our government funding, even within the government, I manage two different grants from two different sort of departments within the government. How the money is managed is very different between each of those, Department of Justice versus Health and Human Services. So some are easier and some are more difficult than others. So it really depends. But to Jessica's point, if you're in an organization with multiple funding streams and you can see over the years that their financials are doing well or that they're growing in size, that's typically a good thing. I would also say to that point is if you can see who is giving the money, if it's coming from a foundation or a charity or another organization that maybe does not line up with your values or things that you support, they will be directing the work of the place that you'd be thinking of working on. So it's not always as apparent and upfront on some websites, but if you can see that a particular organization is getting funding to do some work from a foundation or an individual, that's going to influence the work that's being done there as well. So make sure you're on board with it.
I also think you want to, funding is really important, but things are going to be, we're in uncharted territory right now. And so I think finding a job is probably going to be difficult, and finding multiple offers from multiple different places is probably going to be even more difficult. And so looking into funding is really important, but probably even more important is looking into the organizational culture and structure to get a better sense of what your daily work life will be looking like, unless, you know, you're specifically going to be working on the pieces of bringing funding in. I think from my experience, which had been more healthcare oriented, but philanthropy is the easiest money to get. Oftentimes that's from single donors or grateful patients in my case. That oftentimes doesn't have a lot of strings attached to it. Or if it does, it doesn't demand like a big grant report, or there's not as much accountability. Next, I think foundations and private grants. Those are definitely more accountability than philanthropy, but oftentimes the requirements aren't as stringent. And then in my field, the government grants are always the most difficult. They always have the most requirements, the most things you have to sign up for ahead of time, the most reporting that you have to do. And I think that's really important because it costs a lot of money to do reporting, and it costs a lot of money to keep up with all of the things that you need to do. And so if you're getting a $5,000 grant that has a ton of work attached to it, you really want to think as to whether or not that's worth it. Whereas if you're getting a small grant that doesn't have a lot of work attached to it, that may be a better option. And so there's a lot of things when you're thinking about funding that you need to weigh. Not every dollar equals a dollar.
Thanks, Jennifer. And for those of you who are like, what was the 990 that Jessica's talking about? I actually have some resources on 990s that I can send out to you all. I took a great class in graduate school and we talked about 990s, and we'll talk later along about salary. But as Jessica mentioned, you can see the top salary for an NGO. And this is probably more applicable for small NGOs, but if the fifth salary person is making less than what you want to make in the position that you're applying for, then it's probably a sign that you shouldn't apply for a job at that NGO, because salaries at NGOs can vary quite a lot depending on the size of the NGO and the resources. So we're going to go into NGO size and locations. This is a good segue. So all of you work at fairly large NGOs. So from your experience, what would you say are the advantages and disadvantages at working on a larger NGO versus a smaller NGO? And we'll have a follow-up later about working with people across time zones and countries. So right now you can just focus on size if you'd like.
So I think larger NGOs are much more stable. They oftentimes have many revenue streams. They oftentimes have redundant positions, and so there's plenty of people to do the work. They also have a lot of rules and bureaucracies because they've had systems that are set up. There's layers of people oftentimes. So in order to get approvals, you have to follow certain processes, take things up the ladder. Oftentimes there's a lot of politics involved. Whereas smaller nonprofits are operating on a shoestring budget with not a lot of people, so everyone's kind of doing everything. You get a lot of exposure to a lot of different positions. Funding is oftentimes not as stable. That's probably not always the case, but people are small for a reason generally, and so there's a lot of competing for scarce resources. But you know, a small nonprofit may have 7 people, and so you're all making decisions together. There's not a lot of bureaucracy other than the board oftentimes. You can be very nimble, move very quickly. You can feel like you're really a part of the process. So they can be really different, and there's pluses and minuses on both sides probably.
Yeah, I think the first place I worked at out of grad school, it was pretty small local NGO, and like Jen said, it was pretty nimble. You could do things on the fly. You didn't really have to, if you had an idea, you could do it. You didn't really have to like go through a lot of processes and things like that. You know, I also had to paint my office and assemble my desk myself, and, you know, kind of help, you know, do like random things that normally would never have to do in another position. And so there's sort of things that go along. I mean, it felt more like I'm working with an NGO within my Peace Corps service. And so there are pros and cons to that, because there's other things that you look back on and it's like, how would like in a professional environment allow some of this stuff to go on? But then, you know, working at a larger NGO now, can be mind numbing sometimes of like, I just want some pins. I just need some pins. Why do I have to go through this whole process to get some pins for my office? And it'd be such a pain. But, you know, again, there can be pros and cons to each of those things.
So IFPRI is approximately 500 staff members around the world, and 250 of us are based at headquarters in Washington. So it's still, I mean, we're still small enough that I know everyone that I need to know on a first name basis. So it's not, I mean, there's bureaucracy at the same time, like, I don't know, bureaucracy sucks at the same time. It's what gives you a lot of benefits, and, I don't know, there are benefits to it as well. Anyway, so so in terms of, I mean, size, I feel like there's a lot of differences, like based on the management structure of any individual place, and even within my organization, our division director is set on flexibility in every way, like make the system work for you as best as you can. I know a lot of people, or a lot of managers, senior managers, really try to be by the book. Yeah, I don't have a lot more to say on the topic, sorry.
You did mention benefits, though, and I think that that's another important piece when you think about a larger NGO versus a smaller NGO. And I don't think that's always the case, because some small NGOs can have incredible benefits. But when you think about retirement plans and healthcare, oftentimes it's easier to get better benefits in those areas with larger NGOs. And sometimes with smaller NGOs, you can have a lot more flexibility. It sounds like Jessica's organization strives to be very flexible, but I have found the larger an organization gets, the more rules they have to have, just because now they have a whole HR department, and there's, you can't treat everyone different. And so there starts to be a lot more rules the larger a place gets. But
yeah, we didn't really have an HR department at my first organization, and so there was no rules that really you needed to follow. Whereas now, yeah, everybody has to go through the same process.
So Matt, as someone who worked at a smaller NGO, can you talk about what it's like having a team that's so small? I mean, how small was that first NGO you worked at?
Oh, I think within the building that we worked with, there was probably 50 or 60 people. I worked in a team of maybe 8 or 9. And I mean, in both ways, it's, I would say it was great, and again, I would say versus the size, it had to do more with the culture of the organization. No one ever missed a birthday. There was cakes all the time because everybody got their birthday celebrated. People, I still have long-lasting friends from that environment that I made when, I first moved to DC. It was really just warm and friendly. Everybody sort of knew everybody across different programs. And it was a community-based organization, and it felt very much like a community of its own. And so now at the larger organization, I feel close with my team, and I like other, friendly with other people in the office, but it's team, I would say it's like team by team dependent, because we are bigger. It's sort of influencing the organizational culture as a whole can be a bit more difficult. And because it is more rules-based and a bit more formal, it's a different type of environment. And in some ways that can be good. You don't necessarily want to be, friends with everybody you work with, and you want to leave work at work. And I would say it's easier at a larger organization versus something like that, a small organization where everyone's all in it together and everyone's wearing multiple hats. So it becomes more of like a friends and family environment.
I will add, I think it's easier to sort of prove yourself and move up and get opportunities in a smaller organization, because there are always new spaces that need to be filled by, and they see you and they trust you and they're like, yeah, she can take on that. In a bigger organization, there's always someone else who can sort of move in at a lateral level, and I think it can be more difficult to move up if there aren't sort of clear systems for doing that set in place already. I know that that's certainly one of the complaints that a lot of my more junior colleagues have, is that sort of it's very difficult to move up. You're sort of stuck at one sort of, or a set of positions for the long term.
That's an interesting comment, because I would think at a small organization, at a certain point, you cap out of where you can go. But you're saying in your organization, it's almost the opposite, that there's too many people who can swoop in and do the job that you want to take.
I think both can probably be true. I think that goes back to the culture of an organization, which is really hard to get a sense of when you're interviewing. But some organizations do a really good job of promoting within, and others like really kind of trap people into positions because that's what's best for the organization, that has someone trained to continue doing that, and make it a little more difficult to move up or move within the organization. And sometimes it's hard to know until you're in an organization. So I think, you want to really think about what questions you're asking when you're interviewing, and also, can you find other people who work at that organization that you can ask questions of that aren't part of the interview process. Can be really helpful in getting a better idea of the culture, because oftentimes at interviews, everything seems really wonderful, because you're wonderful, they're wonderful, everyone's wonderful. And so getting outside of kind of that interview setting to get some more information can be really helpful.
And on the topic of things to consider when you're applying for a job, how would you say the dynamic is at your organizations where you're potentially working with people at different locations or in different time zones? Do you all think that that's also partly influenced by the culture of the organization, or would you say there's certain things that if you have multiple locations, it's just going to be a challenge or a benefit to the organization?
So my organization works only in Northern Virginia, but we have 5 different hospital centers. And so each one has its own unique culture. Being in administration, I have to work with each of them, but not everyone has to do that. Some people just work within one hospital setting. I think in healthcare, some of the benefits are we can learn from each other. What one hospital system does, another one can implement. And some of the downside is it's a lot more people to know, it's a lot more politics to know, things are spread out a little bit, things may be done very differently at one place versus the other. So it's a steeper learning curve than if it was just one small group of people in one space. But I know that's pretty different than Matt and Jessica, so they probably have some better advice on that.
Not really. We have different office locations, and I would say people who are in a different office location, whereas I'm at our headquarters office, the office culture is different. The people that you work with are different. What do they say? Like, you don't leave a job, you leave a supervisor. So I mean, you could have a great office environment. If you have a terrible supervisor, it's not going to be a nice thing. So a big thing would be getting to know that person as you're going through the interview process, because they're going to kind of make or break your life in that role. And so if you have a good supervisor and a good team, even if kind of the rest of the organization, there might be some issues with it, it can still be a real positive environment.
In terms of sort of working across offices and cultures, at IFPRI, we sort of deal with the dynamic of not just office cultures, but then, you know, country, like what is the work environment in general in Senegal compared to the United States? And, you know, it can be very different and different subtleties to address. I think you know, the time zone issue is, it's a pain. It's also just like par for the course with any sort of international organization. You have to sort of learn to set your own boundaries so that doesn't like overrun your life completely. I have a colleague who's like always on calls at like 11 p.m. at night. I won't do that. I will take my early morning calls from home, like 7 or 8 a.m. calls. Like I can do that from home, and quite frankly, I don't have those that often. Once a year, I will end up in some ridiculous situation where I have to, you know, be in a meeting starting at like 3 or 4 a.m. But I've intentionally made that trade-off. Like I do not want to travel around the world for this meeting, so I'm going to take the call from 3 o'clock in the morning at home. So I mean, it's just you know, par for the course in that regard. But at the same time, we're very intentional in our team in particular about learning how to work remotely with colleagues. My direct boss, and then sort of someone else who I don't report to directly, but is at a senior level that I work with a lot, they have both worked remotely for over 20 years. And I'm somehow managed to be like quite close with them, because, you know, we sort of learn to balance these dynamics of what it's like to work with someone, you know, far away, and how to communicate consistently and clearly about work plans and expectations and sort of work, you know, work dynamics, and it works. It's just, you know, clear and open communication makes it happen. And with that in mind, we've transferred to COVID world very easily. So.
Yeah, Jessica, so where I work for the U.S. Forest Service International Programs Office on the Latin America and Caribbean team, and I feel very lucky I do not have to deal with many time zones at all. My colleagues on the Asia team, you know, it's a 12-hour plus time difference, and I'm just even now thinking having to do programming and things with COVID, the time zone difference, they're probably having very odd, increasingly odd hours, and I do think you have to go in and define what hours you're going to work, or you easily can be online 24/7. I'm sure many of you from your Peace Corps experience are familiar with WhatsApp, and WhatsApp for work groups can be just as crazy as WhatsApp and Peace Corps, so you really have to set those professional boundaries. And also, you know, we're in a COVID world. No one's traveling right now, but eventually you will be. And I feel really fortunate that in Latin America, the flights I have to take down to Central America are only a few hours. It's not those transatlantic flights with multiple layovers to more remote locations in Asia or Africa. So something to also factor in if you are fortunate enough to have a decision where you get to choose what geographic part of the world you're working with. And so now we're going to transition into a part that I think many people are very interested in, which is how do you get your job? How do you get a job at an NGO? That's what everybody wants to know. So we're going to open up a very broad question, which is, what's the best way to get your foot in the door at a specific NGO? If you really value or are interested in the work of a specific NGO and that's your dream to work there, how do you shoot your shot and try to get into that NGO?
I would say figure out what they're hiring for and get the skills for that position. I know that's sort of a duh answer, but the thing that I've seen, for example, people blanketing, it almost looks worse when I've seen people at my organization, for example, blanket applications for tons of different positions, and they all require different skills and they all require different experience. And so the sort of perception is this person really wants to work here, but has no idea what we do or what the work is that we're doing because they just are applying for every job here under the sun. I mean, from director of communications positions to program assistant positions, you know, huge experience and background differences and things like that. And so I would say if you're looking to get your foot in the door, focus first on what you want to do and not necessarily the organization that you want to work at. I mean, I think there's organizations that will fall into what it is that you want to do, and then look at the position that is doing more or less what you're most interested in. And if it takes you learning, you know, some skills or being able to get that so you can get your foot in the door, work on that. And I know this is a later sort of question, but everyone's Peace Corps experiences is so varied and different. You can pull that out into your resume and show that you have a skill or experience in a particular area, you know, that is highlighted in a position rather than just say, you know, I was a Peace Corps volunteer and did community development work. You know, really narrow down in terms of if you worked with a specific population or did a specific type of work and that's something that you would need to do in the position, that's what you should highlight in your resume, because it'll separate you out from other people.
So I would definitely echo what Matt has to say. This idea of thinking this is the one organization that I want to work at and the only place that I will be happy is probably not going to be a fruitful way of approaching getting a job. It may work out for you, but it most likely won't. There's a, you know, as Matt said, this idea of blanketing, like when I go into like the HR system, when we're hiring for a specific position, I can see with a pretty easy click, every position that the person whose application I'm looking at, I can look at every position that they've applied for with no effort. And so it looks ridiculous if you literally applied to every open position at the organization, not knowing anything. Like it was just total disregard for the skill level and content work of that particular position. I think sort of a better way of approaching that is sort of setting a vision. Like, what is your own? We talked about institutional mission statements, but like setting your own personal like mission statement for yourself, like this, like, you know, my goal is that I want to be in like, this isn't for me personally, I'm speaking hypothetically, like I want to be like leading an organization that serves migrant youth in a way that promotes justice and, you know, whatever. And that like, that's your individual mission statement. There can be lots of options for sort of jobs that could get you there. And sort of like think with that like 5 or 10 year goal in mind in terms of preparing yourself to get there. In terms of like getting a job at a specific place, like quite frankly, if like someone like persistently emails me or tries to reach me in other ways, it's happened, that they're like, hi, I've never met you, but I want you to give me this job. I'm like, one, like, we don't have a position open for that. Like, what do you want me to do? Even if there is a position open, like, I'm often like ethically bound to give like fair consideration to the whole applicant, you know, whole set of applicants. So I don't necessarily think that that's necessarily a strategic approach either. I do know that. So one strategy that I can think of that did work for someone that I now work with is that like it was her dream job to work on our team specifically, and she reached out to someone else who was at that same level of the spot she'd was interested in to really learn a lot in detail about the position and you know really get information. And then like this junior person who's like desperate, overworked, and needs someone to like be fulfilling the other half of her role, really became an advocate for her and was like, this applicant is awesome because she, you know, spent so much time talking to me about all this stuff. So that did work in her case. But I guess I would just go back to this idea of like building your personal mission, or like, what are your values, and how's your next job going to get you to that final goal, those big pictures?
One thing that I think is really important is informational interviews. I think informational interviews are a great way to get to know an organization, get to know a person. Oftentimes there may be opportunity to talk about yourself, not always, and I wouldn't push that, but really, like, I would never turn down someone for an informational interview. And so I think the fact that you have a large Peace Corps network, and maybe where you went to undergrad, looking to see who works at a place you want to work at and what you have in common with them, or even cold emailing someone to just say, hey, can I come in and find out more about what you do and what your company does? And then showing up to that interview really prepared. So having done the research that you can do online, so that you're not asking someone to tell you what you can find online, and then really asking more personal, in-depth questions to show that you're taking their time and you took your own time to do your research because it's something that's really important to you. And then just echoing a little bit what Jessica said, and probably what Matt touched on a little bit as well, is I think it's always good to figure out, where do you want to be in 10 years and work yourself backwards from that. It's, you know, oftentimes we can't have our dream job, our first job, or even our second job. And so really thinking about, what are all the skills you need to have and what are the pieces you need to put into place to make yourself the best applicant that you can, and maybe taking some jobs in the meanwhile that aren't your dream job, but start putting some of those skills into place so that you can work your way into the job that you really want to have.
And I'll just say, Jen is a lot nicer than me. I would definitely turn it down informational interview. So if you do it, the people I've given plenty of informational interviews, but it's always, they've made it as easy as possible. Whether saying, I will phone call, I will come to your office, I will only take 15 minutes of your time, like whatever it is, you know, you do all the legwork. It's the people that are like, hey, do you want to come meet me, you know, someplace 30 miles away for coffee for an hour? You know, I'm available next Tuesday morning. It's like, I'm not even going to respond to that. So it is a really good way, because then if you do apply, I then remember, oh, I'm going to look at this person's resume because I remember them, but make it easy on the person so that, you know, it's hard for them to say no. We're not all as nice as Jen.
Okay, fair. I'm not very nice, but I do think, like, if you make an effort, that's what I'm saying, like, look at their LinkedIn profile, find something you have in common with them, but definitely make it easy on them. Because I think we're all really busy, and so expecting someone to show up on your terms. Nowadays, I'm really impressed when someone is very thoughtful and professional, because believe it or not, people don't necessarily know how to write professional emails, and they don't know how to professionally request things. And so I think if you can figure out how to do that in a very professional way, chances are greater. But I guess don't try Matt, come to my office.
I think it's important that when you're reaching out to someone, that you've targeted them for their specific, like, something specific about them and their work. I get a lot of very broad informational requests that are just like, I want to work at your institution. Can you take an hour? Will you give me an hour of your time? And I'm like, no, that's me volunteering. Like, if I do that. And so, I mean, I take on a lot of interns. I spend a lot of time providing professional development opportunities for my interns, for example, and providing mentorship through those strategies. And I'm happy to talk to someone who's interested in my specific area. But if it's just someone who's like, I like you where you work, I tend to completely ignore that.
Hey Susan, this is Randy. I had a quick follow-up question for Jen on something that she said earlier, and I think this ties to the group. Jen, you talked about kind of not being afraid or taking on the right skill sets initially, rather than going for like your dream organization. And you guys have had quite a diverse career path to get you, where you guys are at today, which are all really great positions. But how valuable were those little small step jobs or those little small NGOs that you guys work for? Like, how valuable was that for you when you actually were getting ready to get to your dream job? Was it really valuable, or do you still rely on those skill sets that you learned and your experiences during that time?
I'm going to answer that. The other way to get your foot in the door is to volunteer. If the organization takes volunteers. Okay. Small steps. I think the small steps are the most important things you can do, but you have to be really mindful about the small steps you take. I have gotten most of my jobs after my first job by building relationships and being part of networks. So I got my first job, and then I joined the professional organization that had to do with that job, and I joined some community groups, and I identified mentors within my organization and external mentors. And all of that was really important for my future jobs, and also the skills that I gained. So just learning how to work with people, learning how the politics of an organization works, learning every small step is a really important step, because sometimes your dream job is not your dream job and you don't know it because you haven't been in the field long enough. But maybe your dream job really is your dream job, and the best way to get that dream job is by all the relationships you build. And so the amount of time you can invest in not just going to work 9 to 5 every day, but going to the happy hours and finding mentors and presenting when there's opportunities, all of those are really important in kind of cultivating relationships that are going to help you get to where you need to get. I know in healthcare it's really small. I think the same can probably be said for other organizations as well. Like, the world is not as big as we think it is. And even when I think about Peace Corps, half the time people we went to Peace Corps with are all working together, but at different NGOs. And so really building those relationships can be key to moving up the ladder or getting your next best job.
That was awesome. Thanks.
Great. Well, speaking of Peace Corps, my next question for you all is, how do you take your experience from Peace Corps and make it look good in your resume? How do you leverage your Peace Corps experience when you're applying for jobs?
I don't know about y'all, but I did so many different. At one point, I was a youth volunteer, and I was installing biosand water filters. I don't know why the hell I was doing that, but like, I just was doing that for a few months. I've never put that on a resume, but if I was applying for a job and that somehow was going to be relevant, I would pull that out and change my resume in terms of my Peace Corps experience, because especially when I was starting, the number of bullet points I had under my Peace Corps experience was all these sort of all over the place things. And then you can pull out the things that are specific for that job and highlight them. Whereas if you were maybe applying for another position, you may not even talk about that. So, be specific and sort of, if a particular position is looking for a certain set of experiences or certain skills or abilities, if you have done that, or you've kind of developed those skills in maybe just one project that you did while you were in your Peace Corps experience, pull that out and highlight that, and maybe don't talk about, the other, 15 youth groups that you did that this organization or is not relevant to the position, even though that was a big chunk of your time there. Focus on the things that is most pertinent and relevant to that position, because, I think a lot of us end up doing sort of a lot of things that we didn't necessarily sign up to do at the beginning, but, we did it anyway, and it was still beneficial in the long run. So, get credit for it when it's applicable.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, you can make almost, like, do you need budgeting skills? I'm sure you all budgeted for some small projects in your communities. Teamwork and collaboration by interviewing the entire community. I mean, really finding words that are in the job description and finding ways to fit your Peace Corps experience into it. People people who did Peace Corps think it's cool. People who didn't do Peace Corps think it's even cooler. And so there's a lot of ways to really make your experience shine and show how flexible and nimble and, you know, your ability to work within another culture. There's all kinds of ways to adapt what you did in the Peace Corps to fitting certain job expectations and qualities. And so being really creative when you do that can be important.
Yeah, so take that job description, you know, look through it and aim to speak specifically to that job description, particularly at a larger organization. It might not be the case at a smaller organization, but at a larger organization, I'm usually pretty serious about what I have in a job description. There may be like a few extra things that I'd like as like icing on the cake on the side that I don't write in the job description, but I do need you to be fulfilling these roles in the job description. And so, you know, look down there and think of your Peace Corps service. What are my transferable skills? As Jen said, budgeting. For me, a big one is solving your own problems. Like I do not want to have to be like, you know, my computer doesn't work, or how do I do this technology thing? I'm not the person who needs to respond to that. Like, Google it. Like, you know, just like all these problem solving, like basic problem solving skills, you know, the dynamics of like complicated, like community politics, office politics, like these soft skills are things that can be really strong, that you really cultivated as Peace Corps volunteers, that are really important for a lot of organizations. I have also reviewed applicants and sat on interviewing committees that have had former Peace Corps volunteers on them. And some individuals are really able to, we were interviewing returned Peace Corps volunteers, and some individuals are really able to take that information and take their experience and really articulate it well in terms of, you know, what that means for this current job. And others are just kind of a little flaky and out there. Well, look, I did this and this. Like, and it's really like narrowing down that skill set. And I, like, at least for most of the positions that I've helped hire for, I need to see that you like are a systems thinker in terms of what rural life is like in a low or middle income country, and that you can sort of piece through all these like different aspects. So for example, I had was interviewing a former Peace Corps volunteer who had then finished a master's degree, and who kept like articulating, when I wanted her to make links between agriculture and health, she just kept articulating, well, everything is health. Everything is health. And I was like, no, I really need you to like think about this. And then the next applicant who came along, she like really understood, like, and gave really specific examples from her service, like on linking, like, you know, the livelihoods of farmers to you know, the health outcomes of their family members, et cetera. And I could really, like, even though she was a health volunteer, I could really see that she understood like rural livelihoods and how farmers live, et cetera. And that was critical for this position. And so, yeah, just like the systems thinking and then like problem solving are like skills that you have as volunteers that I want to see in applicants that I hire.
Thanks, Jessica. So we're a little bit after 9, and I want to make sure we have time for questions from people online here. So I'm going to combine these last 2 questions for you, which is, what is the typical interview process like? Is there a typical interview process like? And then when you get to the salary part, when there's a job offer and the salary is offered to you, how do you determine if that's an appropriate salary for you? How much wiggle room is there in negotiating at an NGO, or with an NGO, I should say?
If you apply in my organization, none. We just don't. So, and to the point of like larger and smaller organizations, I've interviewed people at a previous organization because there's no HR department, there's no process. It's sort of like, so tell me why you want to look. And it was so disorganized and just sort of kind of informal. And you know, that can be good or bad in different ways. And then other ways it can be really formal, and that you're reading off a sheet, and like, you know, Jessica's talking about, you're addressing the certain sort of roles or responsibilities of a position with a particular question and going down, you know, in a very, you know, controlled format. And so it really can vary, I would say. You know, I mean, I think the biggest things are, you know, you want to be personable and you want to be friendly and respectful, but you also, you know, I think that from an interviewing standpoint, the most predictive thing of how a person is going to perform in the future is how they've done in the past. And so if you are being asked, can you tell me about a time, or can you tell me how you might do, or something like that, tie it to a particular experience and say, well, it's like this time when I was in Peace Corps, this is situation happened, this is what I did, and this is, you know, this is the skill that you're talking about, and this is how I solved this issue, as opposed to being like, well, I in general terms or hypothetically of how you might do something or how you are as a person, if you can tie it to this is how I've done what you're looking for, or like this is example exactly of this particular circumstance, it speaks volumes, as opposed to, and then being able to say like, I don't know, I've never had an experience like that, so I can't give you a particular experience that I've had, but this is how I would approach this situation, or, you know, this is my method of thinking about these things. Because that is almost the most painful thing, is when people are trying to sort of BS it or inflate things within their interview, because then it's like, you know, they're not being honest, or they're not being forthcoming with, you know, their skills and abilities. And a lot of times it's okay if you don't have all the skills for a position, because some of them can be easily learned and some of them are, you know, kind of requirements. So you want to be upfront in that regard, because you also don't want to be in a position and be very ill prepared to do the job.
Would you say that a master's degree is required to enter this field?
Perfect example. I have positions where it says you have to have a master's degree, and the people apply without a master's degree. And so you just, you know, you don't even look at the resume. So pay attention to the requirements on the posting in terms of the level of experience, the type of degree. If you don't have that, you're kind of wasting your time and the other person's time of applying for that job, because those either will automatically get filtered out if it's a, you know, fancier HR system, or, you know, if someone's thumbing through resumes, they're just, you know, turning the page because I've said you must have a master's degree and you must speak Spanish, and you don't have either of those things. Clearly you did not read the job description, so I'm not even going to consider you. So.
Would you say that?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to echo what Matt said, read the job description and write a cover letter, and make sure that you, when I read a cover letter, I think that the two big things that I look for the most are, one, did you read the job description, and like, do you understand what we do as an organization in general? You would think that's kind of basic, but then you read a cover letter that sort of misses the mark entirely, and it becomes clear that that person would be a poor fit for the organization overall. Additionally, I do want to see that you have some passion for the work, and particularly working at an NGO, where a lot of the reward for your effort is often, to at least some extent, is intrinsically rewarded. That having that passion and excitement for the work, I think, is really critical. And I think that you can usually leverage some of your Peace Corps experience in that regard. And I think it's great to see that. In terms of the interviewing process, for us, we typically interview for any one position. We would typically start out interviewing like 3 of our top candidates. And those are typically 1-hour interviews, I believe. And they're either in in person or over the phone. And I wouldn't say that we necessarily have a preference for in person or over the phone, because we do aim to hire from a variety of places. Sometimes we sort of make assumptions that someone's not going to show up in person because they live far away, and then they show up and have driven 6 hours and didn't tell HR or anyone that they were going to do that. And that does make for a weird situation. I don't think it's wrong to show up, but you should tell people in advance. I think typically, I think our applicants, in addition to with the interview committee, they also have like a one-on-one hour interview with HR. If you're applying for any sort of admin position, my understanding is that those individuals take like an Excel knowledge test and like a typing test and things like that. But if it's not an admin position, there won't be anything of that nature. Language skills, we definitely test language skills. If you say you speak a specific language, there will typically be someone on the interview committee who will speak that language as well, and enter into conversation with you and expect you to be able to engage in that conversation. So don't tell anyone that you speak Russian unless you really do. And then in terms of salaries, I did look up our starting salary pay, like the pay band for starting level positions. It appears to me, though I can't speak for certain, I didn't start at an entry level position, so I can't really say for sure. But for entry level positions that require a bachelor's degree or that are targeting someone with a bachelor's degree, it looks like this pay is somewhere between $45,000 and $55,000 a year. And then for starting salaries with a master's degree, it appears to be between $50,000 and $65,000 per year. Places that are larger organizations and have serious HR departments are usually pretty organized around those numbers and aren't going to like give you 20% more, because that would create inequity within the institution, as they like to say. However, I do think it's always good practice to ask for more than you're being offered, but don't be unreasonable. People will think you're nuts. Ask for 10 to 20% more than what your offer is, and that's safe, it's respectable. You may hear no, you may get part of that, but it's a totally, I think that dynamic is acceptable and it won't be frowned upon if you make a request for a slightly larger offer than what you're given, regardless of whether you're given it or not. It's an appropriate part of professional dynamics. So don't be afraid to aim to ask more, but justify why. If you have a competing offer, that does help.
As long as you really have a competing offer and you
yes.
are willing
ask to see it. They will ask to see it. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I would always negotiate salary within reason. I've never pulled someone's job offer because they asked for more money, although also do it within reason. I think there are other things that you can negotiate for as well, like potentially more vacation time or work from home or additional funding for conferences. It's never a bad thing to negotiate. I think it's just important to know that it may not happen. The other thing that I have found is that people think they're going to get paid a lot more than they are. Really trying to understand what is a starting salary for the type of work you're trying to do, so that your expectations aren't so far out of line with what market rate is. Because especially for larger NGOs, there's all these rules about what you can pay people, and you have to be within certain bands. And for smaller NGOs, they don't have any money. So even though they could pay you more, they don't have it usually. So it's just things worth keeping in mind as you're thinking about salary.
Our starting salaries are about the same as what Jessica said as well. And that's in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. I would say that probably would go up or down depending where you are. If you're in Texas, it's going to be less. If you're in New York City or San Francisco, it might be more. Depends on the cost of living.
How often do you guys use languages in your job?
I
Every
spoke Spanish
day.
every day until my most recent position because I don't deal with clients anymore. But before I spoke Spanish every single day.
Great.
I don't speak Spanish that often, but I speak really poor French quite often. So, yeah.
I rarely speak another language. I think the only time I would be speaking another language would be to do therapy, and my Spanish isn't good enough to do therapy at this point. So I may help people with directions. I do that quite often, but that's about it.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Does anyone else have questions? Feel free to ask them out loud or type them in the chat box.
I see a, oh, go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, so for the folks who, just for folks in general who are, you know, starting their careers and coming back from service, potentially maybe going to grad school, if you could look back in on your careers right now, what would be the 1-2 pieces of advice that you would give to this group as far as for being successful in the NGO field, if that's what they're interested in? What would be the 1 to 2 things that that's been your rock as far as your career development?
I would say network with anyone and everyone you can. To me, that's one of the most important things you can do, because relationships are how the world functions.
Yeah. I would say in terms of my work, go ahead, Jessica, you first.
Okay. I was just going to say that Matt brought up earlier the idea that, I think it was Matt, I can't remember, that a manager or your supervisor in a position really makes or breaks your daily quality of life. And you need to, if you have bad intuition about someone, or you hear rumors about someone from other people who have worked at an organization, take it seriously and run. Everyone has different working dynamics. I was once told when applying for a job by someone who was not the hiring manager, but it was very odd dynamic. I won't go into detail, but the woman basically said, I know that you know people who have worked here. Your direct manager would be a crazy, awful person, but a specific type of crazy, awful person. Figure it out if that's the type of person you can work with or not. And I was like, okay, this is weird. And so I used my networks and I figured it out and decided that wasn't a good fit for me. But yeah, these dynamics are really important, and don't underestimate how important they are.
To the degree thing, I would say just because I've done direct work up until now where I'm in a management position, just because of the path that I've gone, you had to have an MSW. And then at some point I had to have an advanced license for my social work degree. And it's been bad. I mean, it's just been sad to see people who've been good and they've had the experience, but because the requirement is that you have an MSW, like they're kind of hamstrung and they can't continue because they don't meet the basic education requirement. So in a thing like social work, where it is very dependent that you have an MSW before you can sort of move up the ranks in some areas, get that degree first, because it might be harder to go back and do it. And there's just a certain ceiling at some point because funders or, licensors or, whoever, they require it. So you're going to need it if you want to, that's the track that you want to go.
So there's a question in the chat window that's directed to me. Should I summarize it and then ask and then respond?
Yes, that'd be great.
Great. So this is from Andrea, and she asks, how hard is it to get a foot in the door with IFPRI without a PhD, seeing that IFPRI is a research-based organization? And then The second part is, if PRE is part of a consortium, how do organizations within the consortium work with one another? Is it possible to transfer laterally? So I'm going to answer that last question first because it's really easy, and then the first one I will go for. So yes, if PRE is part of the Collaborative Group for International Agricultural Research, and so we have sister organizations all engaged in different forms of agriculture research around the world. At this point, there's a whole restructuring going on. At this point, there's no way to transfer laterally. I mean, we have relationships within those organizations. We don't have like a common HR or finance or anything of that nature. So no cross-organization transfers. And in terms of getting your foot in the door without a PhD, so we do have positions in research support staff, which are essentially research analysts and research assistants who those positions are ideal for individuals who have completed a master's degree and think that they might want to go on to do a PhD later. A lot of them decide no, and that's fine and a good decision. But that's sort of like the optimal person for the research support staff positions. In addition to the research support staff positions, in terms of non-PhD positions, we also have these sort of, I think they're classified as like corporate service positions. So we have a whole communications division. We have project managers. We have admin staff, etc. I believe that we have a position open as of this week for like a social media specialist, which is in the communications division. So there are opportunities for non-research focused positions. I think the key thing is, though, if you enter and you want to do the research track, you can't move into senior research track positions without a PhD.
Well, while people wait to think if they have any more questions, I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to thank Randy, a fellow Friends of the Dominican Republic board member, who got us networked up with all of them. Again, networking is how we made this panel happen. It's good to stay in touch with your friends from Peace Corps. Another great networking resource are your regional and RPCV groups. So there might be, for example, there's RPCVs of Washington, D.C., and they often have networking groups, mentoring, virtual happy hours are going on right now. So the National Peace Corps Association, their website has a list of all the different country and groups. So you can look there and see if you can link up with other people. And that's a great way to get some mentorship. If you don't know who to reach out to, there's often people in these associations who are organizing mentorship programs. We at Friends of the Dominican Republic are going to start dipping our toe back into mentorship. So if you're a Friends of the DR member, keep your eyes out for our next newsletter. We're going to have something in there about recruiting mentors, and hopefully we'll get enough that we can actually start a program and start reaching out to younger RPCVs who want some guidance on starting their careers. Any additional questions out there?
This question is kind of piggybacking on Jessica's answer earlier. In terms of the supervisor making or breaking your quality of life, is there a way during the interview or before to learn about what kind of supervisor you might be working with without having to directly go to the staff that works with them or them directly?
So I think in most positions, I may be wrong on this, that whoever would supervise you is most likely on the hiring committee. I might be wrong about that, but that would be a common dynamic. I think there are good ways to ask and probe around this, like ask specifically who supervises the position, and then you'll at least know if that person is in the room, and then ask about what the management style is like, what sort of what sort of like expectations about daily work patterns and dynamics will be, etc. And I mean, you can get a vibe from people, especially if you know who that individual is. Yeah.
And I'll often ask, like, what's your supervision style, and how do you work? What type of relationship do you like to have with the people you supervise? I think those are all appropriate questions. And I think if for some reason your supervisor is not interviewing you, that you could definitely say, I'd like to have a brief interview with my supervisor. I would expect people to ask that and want to know who their supervisor is. And I would expect people to ask me questions about my supervision style. And so I think there's probably like a whole list of questions on the internet to get at that. But I think paying attention to the vibe and also asking some specific questions, you're never going to know for sure. Because like I said earlier, everyone's on their best behavior during an interview. But I think asking those questions starts to give you some insight. And if there's red flags, that's when you really start trying to find other people who have worked there before that no longer work there, or people that currently work there that you can ask questions to. Oftentimes when I interview at places, I'll ask to interview with the supervisor, but I also may ask to have meetings with people who would be my colleagues, so lateral people, and ask some of those questions to them as well. And an organization that won't let you have those meetings, that tells you something about the organization.
Yeah. I heard.
Yeah.
That,
I was going to say, ideally, it should be easy to find someone that you can talk to that will speak well of organization. If they won't let you, then yeah, as Jen said, that's a red flag for that supervisor. Yeah.
Is it a red flag if the supervisor to be asks you what kind of supervisor you work best with?
I think that's a great.
I don't think that's a red flag at all. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that with interviews, it's both sides, right? You're trying to figure out if they're the best fit for you, but they're also trying to figure out if you're going to be the best fit for them. If, you work at an organization and your supervisor is managing a lot of people, and you say you like to have daily conversations with your supervisor, they might say like, well, I just don't have the time for that. And maybe that's not a reason why they won't hire you, but it might be something that they address once you're under their wing and they're working with you, is that they set those things up more.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So my question is just that in the case that you have, you're interviewing for a couple positions, they're fairly similar. You're definitely on board with the mission of the organizations. Let's just pretend they're all pretty similar across the board with variables like that. What are some things in the final interview stages that you might ask to really kind of, nail down your decision? I know this is kind of a very personal, subjective question, but yeah, just looking for some insight with that.
Think about the things that are going to make your quality of life better. I think we sort of overlook those in the job panic, but things like flexible work hours, ability to work from home, though I think we're all sick of working at home right now, but in normal world, that's often an important thing. I mean, I think that those are really important. A lot of times you sort of like overlook benefits for a salary issue. I mean, and you probably don't think a lot about the retirement plan, but it's really nice when you have one. So, I mean, those sort of little things are look into those sort of details of things.
Also think things like mentorship. Are they available to mentor? What do they do to grow their employees? Again, I mentioned conferences earlier, but do they have opportunities for you to get additional trainings? What type of upward mobility do they have? Like, do they have career ladders? Quality of life is super important, so I definitely think that's important. again, if there's any way to talk to like lateral colleagues to get a sense of who you'll be working with, who you work with every day, I mean, you're with them a lot. And so trying to get a sense of what place you culturally fit into the best can be really important to that quality of life and wanting to go to work.
Would you recommend asking to take a tour of the workplace after the interview?
Oh, yeah, I don't think
That's important to you.
Yeah, sure. I don't think that's a bad question. I mean, it is curious
ahead,
like, what your office space will be like, because sometimes you're going to be in a basement hole with no windows, and sometimes you're going to have a nice office. Maybe that's important to you. Space is a premium depending on where you're at.
You should have, I mean, questions like, will I get a window? Can I have space to myself? Like those are bad questions to have.
Yeah, just to kind of.
I was going to say, related to that, I mean, one of the things that that's been helpful and we've done with our staff before is that think of the things that most motivate you. Some people are motivated most, like the salary is the most important thing, or work-life balance is the most important thing, or flexibility, or the environment that you work in, or the team environment. And whatever of those things is most important to you, you can focus and spend more time on that. I've worked in really bad offices throughout the years, and I just don't care. It doesn't it's not really a thing that is most important to me. But things like work-life balance is much more important, or like the environment, the team environment within, or, as Jen mentioned, focus on professional development and growth. And some organizations might be like, no, we don't do any of those things, but we'll pay you a boatload of money. And if that's the most important thing to you, then that's a good thing. Then you'll be most motivated by that. So I would think about the things that are most important and motivating to you and spend time asking those questions.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just have a follow-up to kind of those comments. So obviously right now, everything is remote interviews. Are there just any like brief tips possibly that you might have specifically, we can't tour the office, I can't meet anyone in person, everything's a scheduled Zoom interview. Any just, it's kind of, it's much less personal. So just any tips maybe for making it feel a little bit more personal? I mean, obviously sending, follow-up emails and, thank yous and stuff, but it does feel so, so tech-based, it's kind of sterilized.
I mean, handwritten thank yous go a long way, although I don't know where you would send them now, because if people aren't in their offices, it's probably not appropriate to ask for home addresses. I still think you can Zoom with counterpart. I think asking really targeted questions, like people who ask me a lot of questions tells me that they're really invested in the position. Not that they just want any position, but that they want that position and that they want to know it's a good fit for them. And that's important to me, because I don't want to hire someone who's going to leave in 2 months or who doesn't really want to be there, who just wants a job. And I think even though they can't walk you down to someone else's office, I think to say like, hey, it's really hard to interview over Zoom. I'd love to talk to some of the other people who work there. Is there any way you could set up a few 10 or 15-minute meetings with me, or give me their email address so I could write them some questions? I just can't believe anyone would say no to that, because they want to make sure you're going to be happy. It costs a lot of money to hire people. And so someone who's not willing to go the extra distance for you, it wouldn't be a deal breaker, but I think it would tell you a lot about the company.
Bandera roja, red flag.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Susan, you had a couple questions?
Oh, I didn't have questions. I was just adding some comments in the chat. A clever way that you can figure out work dynamics is asking what happened to the person before you. That's sometimes an easy way to figure out if there's high turnover in the position, or if they're going to grad school, maybe that's an indication that you can't move up as much in the organization as you would like, that you'll have to leave and go somewhere else. And then for benefits, aside from salary, if you're getting similar offers, like the benefits you should be thinking, I know Peace Corps, you don't think about the benefits, but benefits with transit benefits, that's going to become really important once we can go back to work. DC area, you can easily be spending $200 a month on transportation. If the 401k is matching, to what percent? You know, a 1% matching is very different from 5% matching, especially if you stay there in the long term. And how fast does vacation accrual, how long do you have to be there before that percentage increase changes? Some places will give you more vacation time for lower salary if that's a trade-off. And, you know, if you want to travel more and you don't care about your salary so much, you're okay with staying in hostels and whatnot, you know, think about what you want to prioritize with your work-life balance.
I can't leave my job because I can't get the same vacation benefits anywhere else.
It's true.
I know people like that. Yeah, that's not an uncommon problem.
The golden handcuffs.
For those who travel in their job, how often have you traveled?
So I travel internationally. I don't travel domestically very much for work. Anyway, it goes through ups and downs. Now is currently a down. But in peak times, I travel once a month, and those are like 24-hour flights to Africa, and they're not in business class. And that takes a toll on the energy levels. But I think, and typically I'm away, I would say around 6 weeks out of the year total. So it's not, a lot of places is a lot worse. But that's sort of my average over the past few years.
Would you say you're traveling to meet people or go to meetings, or what kind of work do you do when you do travel?
So when we do travel, sometimes it's for conferences. Sometimes it's for like capacity building training things. Often it's for either launching research projects, so that, you know, we go and build relationships with these partners, and also like doing the trainings to start off different surveys. That's one of my big reasons for travel, is around specific research projects. That and conference workshop stuff.
Nice. And how long would you say you're out of the country every time you travel? One week, 2 weeks?
On average, a week. I think the longest trip I ever took for work was 3 weeks, but I did that sort of voluntarily, so I didn't have to go back and forth. I think they, like, our team sort of sets not a purposeful max, but like allows people to opt out of anything longer than 2 weeks. But typically my trips are a week, and often they're less. It's not uncommon for me to fly somewhere, be there for 2 to 3 days, and fly home, which is tiring, but is but at the same time, am I going to be tired somewhere around the world, like stay longer, be tired elsewhere, or be tired in my own bed, whatever.
Yeah.
So we are now over time. I want to check in with my panelists if they're okay staying online to answer more questions, or, I don't know if they have kids or other people they got to get into bed. It's getting late for people of a certain age.
They've been gone. They've been gone a long time ago. We would not be on the call if they were still awake. Trust me.
All right. So can you guys stay on for a few more minutes to answer additional questions?
Sure.
Yeah. And I'll just say to the caller whose question is about travel, I think it really varies by where you are and what you're doing and where you're having to travel to. In my office, our Asia team members, they'll also be gone for like 6 weeks at a time because they're just doing back-to-back trips, and they don't want to have to be on those flights. And there's certain times of the year when things just get more booked up. But then in Latin America, sometimes it's really easy just to make that 2 or 3 day trip because it's not so much travel time. And when I applied for my job, they said, I would not be traveling for the first 6 months because they want to test me out and make sure I fit well in the office. And then I traveled on my 3rd day in the office. So sometimes this can be screening because they don't want people applying for a job if they think it's just going to be all travel all the time. They want to make sure you're committed to the position and to the goal and not just the travel part. But you can be surprised sometimes by when they're going to ask you to go travel.
Nice. Thanks, Susan.
Do we have any additional questions here? All right. Well, I want to thank our. Oh, what was that?
I said you'll all be fine. There'll be some highs and lows, but you'll all be fine. It'll work out.
Yeah, as we emphasized with our government job hunting webinar as well, the key is networking. Networking is really going to help you guys out. It's also great to connect with other people who are job hunting and just commiserate on how much you hate writing cover letters, how awful they are to write, but how you got to do them. Sometimes it can just be nice to have someone else to chat with about the struggles and get tips for the job hunt. So after this event, I'll be sending out a recording. I'll also be sending out some information on how to use that 990 form Jessica referenced. And if any of the panelists have information they want to share with people afterwards, they can send it along to me and I'll send that out to all the participants. I want to give a round of applause to our great panelists for being online with us tonight. You know, they're all working full-time jobs and having lots of online meetings. So to add another meeting to their agenda, we appreciate a lot. So thank you all three, Jennifer, Jessica, and Matt, for being on the line. And we're going to have another webinar next week with 3 panelists who work at small NGOs. Some of these NGOs only have 10 people in their offices, so we're getting a very different perspective about what life can be like in the office. And we hope many of you can join us then, or if you know people who are interested, please share the information. I'll send that out after this event as well. So with that, I'm going to let everyone enjoy the rest of their evenings. Thank you all so much for participating, and good luck in your job hunt.
Yes,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.